Good morning, stakeholders, and welcome to the Office of Procurement Regulations question and answer session on the contract reporting for the period 2023-2024, quarter 3. My name is Rhonda Joy Lewis, Corporate Communications Officer, and I'm very pleased for your attendance at our session this morning. We have with us Mr. Aleem Bashk, Head of ICT, who will deliver a brief presentation on the contract reporting requirements for quarter 3, as well as members of our panel, Ms. Klesi Ann Ellis, Ms. Samantha Marchand, and Ms. Devika Singh, who will participate as needed in the question and answer segment. Before we begin today's proceedings, please allow me to go through some helpful tips for a successful session. Please note that your mics will be muted. Your questions during the session can be sent through the chat on the Teams platform. These questions will be collated by our team and addressed in our question and answer segment. Please keep your contributions helpful and be considerate to our presenters and other participants. Do note that this session is being recorded and will be shared via our YouTube and posted on our website. We will also share the details out of today's presentation with you via email. So without further delay, I would now like to hand over to Mr. Bashk, who will go through his brief presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Lewis. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time this morning to listen to what we have to share with you regarding contract reporting. So today's proceedings will be, I will be going through with you the different contract templates, some areas to focus on, and thereafterwards we will enter into the Q&A session where you have the opportunity to ask questions relating to this particular exercise only. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and share in terms of the contract template that was issued out to public bodies on the 18th of June. So in terms of the first template, if you can just verify if that my screen is visible to everyone. So we have confirmation. Not as yet. All right.
Right, we're getting a response that they're able to see our screen as well as hear us.
Okay.
You can just do a thumbs up. Thank you kindly.
Wonderful. Thank you for that confirmation. Okay, so the first template, so there were two templates which were issued for this quarter. This is the quarter 3, which reports for 1st of April until the 30th of June. And there are two templates. The first template is related to procurement activities, which is greater than $75,000. And then we have the second template, which is a new template, which we refer to the micro procurement template, and that is for procurements related to $75,000 and less. So for the first template for over the $75,000, it is more or less the same. Oh, let's make it a little bigger. Based on request for more visibility. In terms of the change that was made, in that we added a new column in the contracts awarded and in the PO in quarter worksheets. This new column relates to emergency procurements. All right, and here you will see on the column M, on the contracts awarded in quarter, this is emergency procurement. So if the procurement that was issued for the particular goods, works, or service was an emergency, then you need to indicate a Y, yes, or if it wasn't, you indicate N. Likewise, in the same purchase order in quarter sheet, this is for procurements issued via purchase orders. Again, under column M, we do have that emergency procurement, okay? So let's now switch to the other template, which is the new template of micro procurement. So under the micro procurement, as we see here, the definition of micro procurement means that the procurement of goods, services, or works for which the value of the procurement doesn't exceed $75,000 And this value is inclusive of taxes, duties, and other charges. Now, this inclusivity of taxes, duties, and other charges also applies to the other template as well, where taxes, duties, and charges for all procurements basically. So in this sheet, we have the key definitions. Again, just what micro procurement is and variation. Under the help tab, this is the definition for each of the sheets. So we have the micro procurement variations, and micro procurement payment. These through data entry sheets. Here we identified the fields and what's the expectation in what needs to be entered and how you have to enter it. I'll also go through a sample of this micro procurement sheet so you can get an idea of how you're going to populate the sheet. Here under the micro procurement category, this is a listing of the categories to be used in the sheet. And these categories, some of this may be familiar to some of you, as these categories are very similar to the categories which are used in the annual budgets which are issued by the Ministry of Finance. We would have added a few other categories in this, for instance, car park fees, catering, as these are some of the common procurement categories which will fall under the micro procurement spend. Now let's move on to the micro procurement worksheet. And here, there aren't many fields to fill in this worksheet. Name of the public body, whether it's a goods, works, or service, the category of goods, works, or service, the procurement method that was used, and the number of times that procurement method was used for the category of goods, works, or service, and the total value of award in TT dollar, and to indicate whether or not an RFQ was used in the process. So I'll just switch across quickly to a sample sheet which was completed for demonstration. So here we have the name of the public body being filled out. So if we look at the first item, the first row, this is procurement related to goods. The category of goods, works, and service is office, stationery, and supplies. And here we have the drop-down list, which you can select from. Then you have to determine, well, for office, stationery, and supplies, there were two types of procurement methods used in the quarter. One method was direct contracting, and the other method was selective tendering / limited bidding. So those were the two methods used. So you analyze your category of goods or work services first, and then you determine the different methods that were used for the procurement. Now for each method, the combination of category of office, stationery, and supplies and selective tendering, the number of times the procurement method was used was 10. So basically, 10 times selective tendering was used for office stationery, and direct contracting was used once for office stationery and supplies. So in total, there were 11 times that office stationery and supplies would have been procured. And now we look at the value, the cumulative value of these. So out of the 10 times that was used, the total figure of the procurement was 250,000. And in the case of direct contracting, that one procurement activity, the value of that was $10,000. Okay. For both of these, an RFQ was used. Let's look now at, for any instance of services, the category was hosting of conferences, seminars, and other functions. And the only procurement method used for this category was selective tendering and limited bidding. And this was used 3 times, this procurement method 3 times. And the total value of these 3 procurements amassed to $90,000. So let's say, for instance, you had this $90,000 will be derived. You had one purchase order for $10,000, another purchase order for $20,000, and then the third purchase order for $60,000. So cumulatively, you get that $90,000 there. Looking at the third example here, where catering was used, and catering, I'm sure you're going to, that's being used constantly throughout. Many different public bodies will utilize this. Again, 2 procurement methods were used: direct contracting and selective tendering / limited bidding. In total, there were 7 procurements issued for catering. So for direct contracting, was used once, and the value of that award was $1,000. In that instance, since it was a direct procurement, what was used was a verbal quotation, and therefore an RFQ was not used in this instance. However, for the 6 items here, the total value of award was $7,500, and RFQ was used in that case. All right. Now, moving on to the next worksheet, we have the micro procurement variations. And this relates to any variations to a purchase order or contract of the offer that falls within the micro procurement value. So if you have a purchase order that was, once it's 75,000 and less, and there are any variations in it in the quarter, you enter it here. So even though you might have had a purchase order that might have been issued in quarter 1, and it was, let's say, $50,000, but you only had a variation in quarter 3, you will enter that variation in the sheet as well. If, for instance, you have a variation for a purchase order contract that is over the 75,000, let's say 100,000. So the PO value, original PO value was 100,000. You do not enter it into this worksheet, as this is only related to micro procurement contracts and variations related to that alone. For anything over the 75,000, you will enter the variation information in the other template that is provided. Okay, so how does one fill out this template? So we put in the name of the public body, for instance, we have, and then we put in the contract reference number or the purchase order reference number. In this example, it is PO 1238904, and the initial value of this PO was $50,000. The value of the variation in this quarter was $10,000. In the other example here, PO 14533, the initial value of the contract was $1,000, and the value of the variation is $1,000. And this third example here, where this is a contract of the initial value of the contract, while it was still under the $75,000, it's $60,000. The value of the variation is greater than 75,000. That's fine, but you still enter it in here. So even though the value of the variation is more than 75,000, you enter that information in here. So in this example, it's $100,000 was the value of the variation, you enter it here. So in total, your overall contract would be $160,000, initial value plus variation. All right, so the key item is to note is the original or initial value of the contract or PO to determine where you enter that information, whether it's in the micro procurement variation tab or in the other template. In terms of the third worksheet, this is the micro procurement payment, and this is where we capture just one lump sum value of all payments made to micro procurement activities that were made within the quarter. All right, so we just put one total value, and in this example, it's $150,000, and it's in TT dollars. You don't need to separate it by various currencies. You convert all of your currencies, and you put it into the TTD value. So just some things to note in terms of the submission. So I'm going to scroll back to the instructions sheet, and please read the instructions sheet and both of the templates. And also we would have shared with you 2 checklists. So just some things to note. So only use these templates and do not use any other format. So please do not try to unlock the worksheet and copy it across to another Excel sheet. Do not send it to us in a PDF. Do not send it to us in a Word. Do not try to use any different type of Excel sheets. Please use these formats. It's important that you follow these instructions, because once we collect this in Excel documents, we then use this information for analysis in terms of uploading into our systems. Okay. In terms of submission, so prior quarters, you were required to submit your submissions to support@opr.org.tt. But now we have introduced a new email address for contractreporting@opr.org.tt. And this is for both templates to submit your sheets to this email. In the past, again, some persons would have submitted it to marketing at OPL.org.tt, to feedback, to different things, So please desist from this. Just submit it to the contract reporting. And then do note the deadline for submission is Monday, 22nd of July, 2024, on or before 4:30 p.m. Again, if you submit your contract workbooks after this timeline, you will be flagged as being non-compliant. If it is you submit your contract, your sheets maybe to a different email address, and we are unable to locate it, you may be flagged as well as being non-compliant. If you submit it in a different format, you'll be flagged as non-compliant. So to avoid all of these, just be very, very careful in terms of the instructions and in terms of use. Okay. So I did mention that there were 2 checklists that were also issued along with these templates. So each checklist provides an indication in terms of what you need to look out for before you actually submit your contract reporting for the quarter. So just have it handy, and before you submit it, go through the checklist. It will be very useful. We would really like to reduce the amount of errors that may potentially occur. So it's best you take your time, look it through, and make sure the information is accurate, correct. Be mindful of what you're sending. Okay. All of this information that you are sending, it feeds towards our report that we submit to Parliament at the end of the fiscal year. So again, the importance of it, bear in mind of that. So this brings me to the end of my section now. I will hand you back over to Ms. Lewis. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bashk. So we are seeing some questions coming in, and we will start to address them at this time. So our first question, can you provide a definition of direct contracting?
Good morning, everyone. We are really grateful for your joining us this morning. And so we're going to take that first question on direct contracting. Direct contracting really speaks to where we are going to involve or engage a supplier without actually asking the supplier per se to submit a bid. Now, under the micro procurement in particular, there's section 25 and subsection 1 that speaks to how direct contracting should be used for micro procurement. And there are 2 conditions that are listed there that you'll need to pay attention to. So it's different from single source procurement, where a single source you would have multiple contractors within the market environment, and you may choose and justify why you're going to one particular contractor without engaging in competition. Direct contracting is different in that you actually are not going to even try to solicit anything from that particular supplier. You're just going to engage that supplier. So the 2 conditions that's part of section 25 of the simplified regulations, and I'm going to read them so that you all are aware as to what it is. It speaks to a procuring entity may utilize direct contracting for a micro procurement where the cost of engaging in any other method of procurement would outweigh the benefits of utilizing any other method of procurement. And so the both conditions must apply. The proposed price to be paid is fair and reasonable, having regards to the description of the goods, work, or service to be acquired, the assessment of the value of the goods, works, or service to be acquired, the geographical location of the place where the goods, works, or service is to be provided, and any other such factors that are reasonable. So while it is a method or an option that is available, it actually needs to meet the conditions for the use of it. And there are some services that meet that particular condition where bidding is not necessarily involved. For example, you may decide you're going to go and buy water for your office. That does not engage tendering per se. It's part of your micro procurement. And so you will directly engage, whether it's PriceSmart, Massey, True Value, and you will purchase that particular item without actually engaging. And when you look at it, the cost of using any other method actually outweighs the benefit of it and the proposed price. Because when you think of the price, you think of the whole cost of actually engaging in the procurement activity as well. It outweighs you going through that process. So it has to meet these conditions, and that's really what direct contracting is and how it is going to be used for micro procurement.
Thank you for your response, Ms. Ellis. Another question. In relation to petty cash transactions, are those to be captured under any of these templates?
Yes, so we want to speak to petty cash transactions, and petty cash is the method of payment. It does not take away from the fact that it's a procurement activity. So the Act covers all procurement related transactions, and the micro procurement sheet is meant to capture all procurement transactions under $75,000. And so it doesn't matter whether you pay by check, ACH, petty cash. Once it's a procurement activity, it gets reported to the OPR.
Thank you, Ms. Ellis. If the variation to the original micro procurement value now takes the overall value over the threshold of $75,000, would we now have to have that vendor register on the depository?
So the variation is what would have allowed that particular vendor to go over. We would have mentioned to the participants in the first cohort that we had yesterday that planning in this procurement environment is critical. And especially under the micro procurement, you would see there is section, and I want to quote the correct section 6 of the regulations that speak to how you estimate. So in order for you to determine whether or not an item is going to be micro procurement from the get-go, you need to first estimate what you think the cost is. And once that activity has been reported to the OPR as micro procurement, the variation, as we would have seen in the example provided by Mr. Bash, that variation is now tied to something that your organization would have classified initially as micro procurement. And so, yes, while the value would have gone above, the actual transaction is still classified based on your reporting as micro procurement. And I'm saying all of that because now we're going to speak to the supplier part of it. So if you have a supplier, the micro procurement does not necessarily require your supplier to be on the procurement depository. You are allowed, the regulations allow for you to have an in-house registry of those suppliers. However, nothing prevents you from using the supplier on the depository. So it could be that the supplier that created where you had that variation may be a supplier that is already within the procurement registry. If they are, then nothing additional is required. If however, they are not, I would believe that it is prudent that you get them to be registered into the OPR procurement depository because chances are future transactions with that particular supplier, based on your experience, may result in them being in the small scale or over 1 million category. And so it would be prudent of your organization to ensure that they get onto, in the same way how we treat with VAT, if you know you're moving from being below the VAT registered category into the, you take that initiative to get yourself, position yourself. It's the same thing we're asking for you all to do with your suppliers. Once they've moved up into that category and you know that future business with that particular supplier probably is going to result in small scale, you classifying that supplier as small scale or over 1 million, yes, you should encourage them to get onto the depository. But from a position of reporting, the reporting end remains the same for that transaction.
Thank you for your response. In terms of the $75,000 limit, does this figure apply to a single transaction or group of similar transactions? For example, if purchasing a group of stationery items and one award for pencils goes to firm A for 20,000 and another to firm B for pens for 40,000 and a third to firm C for paper for 20,000, shall the $75,000 limit be enforced?
All right. So again, I'm taking you all back to section 6 of the regulations to the simplified procurement. And in section 6, it speaks to the different types. And you can have, in this instance, I'm guessing your entity would have set up some type of framework agreement where you may have multiple suppliers who may be providing different things, whether it's pens, pencils, erasers, whatever other types of office stationery. How, depending on the procurement arrangement that you are setting up. So if it's framework agreements, it's the Act speaks to, in the case of framework agreements, the estimated maximum value, and this is 6.1b, the estimated maximum total value of all anticipated procurements under the framework agreement during the duration of the agreement period is how you would estimate. That's what will help you determine whether or not this is really an activity that should be part of your micro procurement, or if it should be part of small scale, or if it should even be in the over 1 million category. All right, so for all your simplified procurement, anytime you're looking to classify, you're really looking back at how did we estimate what the total value or cost would be for this particular arrangement. If in the example that you've given, it's not a framework agreement, but let's say you're buying, as you would have indicated, stationery, and when you sent out your RFQs or whatever method you're using to solicit information, each of those items are going to be awarded separately. Then each of them would be counted as their own individual, because I am guessing if it's awarded separately, you're going to have separate purchase orders. And so each of those purchase orders will stand on their own. Losses will still be, so sorry, wait, just internally here. If you have lots within your procurement, and I can't really see lots in the micro procurement, but if they exist, it would also be overall, because it would be treated as all of the transactions, all of your lots, that's part of your procurement arrangement.
Thank you for your clarification. If a RFP happens to be used at a cost under the micro procurement threshold, would we select yes in the RFQ column?
All right, so RFP and RFQs are two different. So I want to assume that it's an error, but you all can let us know in the chat if you're speaking to, if you have an RFQ and then was an RFQ used, then yes, you're selecting yes in that column if the RFQ was used. So if you did do it, you're going to actually, but if you're speaking about an RFP, which is different from an RFQ, then the answer will be no. But you all can clarify for us.
So, Ms. Phillips, you would just let us know in the chat if you need further clarification on that response. She said she's speaking about an RFP, yes, as sometimes they are used for costs under $75,000.
Right, so if you use an RFP, no, you're not going to select RFQ. Was an RFQ used? The answer there will be no. Because the request for proposal is just that, a request for a proposal, versus where you have a request for quotation. And in the micro procurement, quotations are considered bids. And so you all need to pay attention to that as well. So once you've received the quotation, it is considered a formal bid, right? So if the RFQ was used, then the answer is yes. But if an RFP was used, which is ready to gather data, the answer to that question in column G in the micro procurement template would be no.
Thank you for your response. Considering that this spreadsheet is limited in terms of editing, it will be more efficient if the one for the very first or latest report can be maintained and subsequent quarters are added as time progresses. In essence, it can be a running report. At present, a new spreadsheet is given for each quarter, and the old information must be transferred to the new spreadsheet, and this is very time consuming. When attempting to use the previous quarter format in the current quarter, there are restrictions on the date columns. Would you like to comment, Mr. Bashk?
Well, thank you for that recommendation. So what we will do, we will take that under consideration for the next quarter. But thank you very much for that.
Thank you. If no contractor met the evaluation score for a micro procurement tender and the project is vital, can direct procurement be used then?
If no contractor met the evaluation score, then how are you going to engage? Who are you going to engage in direct contracting? That would be the question I would ask. Because if it is, you would have put out and you would have, whether it's through open bidding or RFQs, and you would have gotten responses, and none of those contractors meet. It's one of two things. It's either the evaluation methodology may be wrong. It may have been the estimations may be wrong. It could be that what we're asking for is different than, well, it's not as clear to those who are submitting, because if it is those persons have submitted to you and they couldn't meet the score, who then are you going to give the direct contract to? So that would be my question.
Okay. As the government moves to digitize the operations of MDAs, there is a need to review this process and allow MDAs to automate this process. As it is, this process represents a very manual process which can be very difficult for larger MDAs.
Okay, that's noted. And yes, we know it can be very time consuming, and for large persons, it can be inefficient. So we are looking at the future to change the process. Now, if you do have any recommendations or any ideas in terms of how we can improve it, you can also send us some of those recommendations so we could take that into consideration going forward.
Thank you for your response. There was just a follow-up, Mr. Bashk, in terms of the spreadsheets, that question in terms of the editing with the old information.
Yes.
So the last question, feeding from that question, can the same be applied to sole select procurement method? That came from Mr. Rishi Ramratan. He just had a follow-up part to his question.
Just remind me, this is
Sure.
where
It starts considering that the spreadsheet is limited in terms of editing.
But
Oh
that's
no,
different,
from no, sorry.
right.
From if the no contractor met the evaluation score.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, so again, the regulations speak to how or when methods can be applied, especially under the micro procurement. So I am cautious to ask the question. Again, if it is you put out solicitation documents, and let's say, for example, you would have sent it to, let's say you used RFP and you sent it to 5 entities who, in our mind, and hopefully in your mind, would have been the 5 best entities that would have been poised to provide this service to your organization. And you've done the evaluation, and none of those 5 entities meet the criteria. Then I ask the question again, to whom does that sole select go? Because effectively what you've said is that no one that we evaluated based on our evaluation criteria as the public body, no one met that criteria. So how do you achieve the objectives of the act? And we want to kind of remind the public bodies and NPOs and those who are involved in the process, even the AOs, if you all are present with us today, the objects of the act apply. So we are still looking at value for money. We are still looking at fairness. We are still looking at equity within the system. So you have to ask yourself at the end of that process, if I would have gone through a tendering process and I arrive at a place where no one met the criteria that I have defined, how do I justify a sole source? Because within the system, while micro procurement does not necessarily have a challenge hearing, complaints can be made. But anything for small scale and above does still evoke a certain level of recourse. And so you want to be careful that we don't just discount and say, well, you know, the method we went out, we tendered, it did not work, and so we're just going to pick somebody. On what basis would you have selected the person you are now saying we're going to apply sole source to, or we're going to go to direct contracting to? So it has to make sense in the context of where you are at. And again, it has to follow the rules that are set out in the regulations.
Thank you for your clarification there, Ms. Ellis. Under micro procurement reporting template, column E, number of times procurement method was used. Does this relate to the total number of times the method was used in the reporting quarter?
Right. So it's related to the number of times it was used in a quarter for the category of goods, works, and services. So here you will see in the example here, we have selective tendering being entered 3 times, right? So total time it was used would have been 6 and 3, 9 and 10. So 19 times. But you're not entering selective tendering / limited bidding 19 and then total value of these 3 amounts. So what you're actually doing is separating the procurement method by the category of goods, works, and services, and that's what you're now counting in terms of determining the number of times the procurement method was used. And based on that number of method, that subset of purchase orders or contracts, you're going to total those and provide the total value of award.
Thank you, Mr. Bashk. So we just pause for a moment just to welcome any further questions based on the template, based on Mr. Bash's presentation, or any other questions that were raised this morning so that we can answer during this segment. Mr. Bash, while we're waiting on some questions, I don't know if you want to remind the stakeholders in terms of the deadlines and the email address that they can use to submit their template.
Sure, of course. So for persons who may have joined the session a bit late, for their benefit, in terms of your submission, you have to submit the contract reports, the 2 templates, to contractreporting@opr.org.tt, and this email address is included on the instructions sheet on both templates, as well as in the email that we would have sent out. And the deadline for submission is Monday, 22nd of July, 2024 at 4:30 p.m. Okay. Reminder to look at the instructions for both worksheets. There are 2 checklists that were submitted, and just to make sure that everyone received the templates, and they can just indicate anyone who may need it, could probably request it here and we could share it. We'll share it after today's session, and we will also share the sample sheet that we have here for the micro procurement, so you can make a reference to it if you have any questions.
Okay.
Just adding to that, we want to remind, or probably we want to stress on the fact that the checklists that would have been provided, they are really for your internal use. It's a tool to just ensure that you have crossed all your T's and dotted all your I's before you submit to the OPR. Your submissions can be deemed non-compliant if they don't meet certain conditions. And so that checklist, both of them, they are there to provide guidance in how you are to complete, what should be included in each of the sheets, each of the areas, and gives you an idea as to what you should not do. All right. Those checklists, you don't have to submit them back to the OPR. They are for your internal use, as well as we want to really stress the naming conventions for the checklist in the emails that would have been sent out. There are naming conventions for both templates, for the templates. We urge you all to use them. As you all could appreciate, when we have over 200 plus public bodies, if you send the template with a generic theme, it means that we need to go in, validate that your template is actually your template, because we've seen errors in the past where public bodies may have submitted a template, but when they selected the name of the public body in error in some instances, they may have pulled the wrong name. So when you name your templates, please ensure you follow the naming conventions before sending them back to the OPR.
And so we have these two checklists on the screen here. So this should be looking familiar to you. So this is one relating to the micro procurement quarterly reporting checklist. And then this is the second checklist here for the greater than $75,000. Right. So those are two checklists that we're referring to here.
Thank you very much, team. So Mr. Adams has a suggestion. He says last year, before the simplified regulations were issued, the OPR issued a sheet outlining the expected contents of the impending regulations. If a comparison sheet along those lines is circulated, it will help guide especially the de novo procurement practitioners.
I'm not sure I understand the question though. So let me just take a look back. Is it in terms of a comparison for the Excel template or?
Question and answer. Yeah, no, they are not.
Yeah.
Well, to be honest, I can't recall that we would have issued expected impending regulations
Yeah.
though. This doesn't seem familiar to me. So I'm not sure in terms of what the comparison would be able to support. Okay, so in terms of the 75, does it figure apply?
Right, we did that already. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So you probably
Check with legal.
check with
other-
one of our internal departments, Mr. Adams, and get back on to you. So in the micro procurement template, can we use all PO raised and not the summary of the category?
So we do need the summary. We do not need the individual details, but you will need the individual details to provide this information. So recommendation would be that you can have this information created on a separate sheet, and then you can summarize that information to put it on the summary sheet here. If you're familiar with Excel's pivot table, it makes it very easy for you to summarize based on your category as well as the micro procurement the type. All right, the procurement type.
Right. So we have another question in our chat. I am seeking clarity on how nonprofit organizations, such as Horses Helping Humans, are expected to comply and complete the forms.
All right. We do have, like we would have indicated, the checklists are there. And if further guidance is needed, you can contact the OPR just in terms of us providing whatever specific questions you may have in understanding the template. But we want to believe that the layout of the template as well as the supporting documents that have provided should be suitable enough to guide you through the process of completing the forms.
Thank you for your response, Ms. Ellis. Can you indicate if funding has to be readily available in order to procure goods, services, and works?
Funding, according to both the Act and the regulation, should be readily available, and or there must be a confirmation that the funding will be provided. If it is not, so I know I'm seeing this is PDRC who is asking this question, and we know that there is a delay sometimes between the actual release of funds through the ministry to the respective bodies. Once you have confirmation, because there's a process of how funding happens. Once you have confirmation that the funding would be provided and you have that on file, you can go ahead and procure. In the absence of that, you should not be procuring, and this applies across the board. So you must have, to all public bodies, you must know that you have the funding. Either you actually have it in hand or you have confirmation that you will have it before you actually procure. Action.
Thank you for your response, Ms. Ellis. Another question. In some instances, based on urgent need, end user department may engage suppliers outside of procurement and an invoice is submitted for works or goods. Notwithstanding that this is less than ideal, how is that captured?
All right, so urgent need should equate to emergency from an act perspective. So firstly, urgent need shouldn't just be that, well, the department felt that it was an urgent need. And the regulations as well as the act defines emergency. It makes it very clear what an emergency is. So it speaks to an exceptional and unforeseeable situation where life, property, equipment, or business continuity is immediately at risk, or where standards of public health, welfare, or safety needs to be reestablished without delay. Urgent need does not necessarily always equate to emergency. And so while I do appreciate that there may be the one-off urgent needs, the procurement departments within all of the ministries and all of our public bodies need to communicate to their user departments that they will be held accountable, meaning the procurement department, for transactions that happen outside of the procurement process. And so if you have some of those already identified, and what you have is an invoice, what I would recommend that you do in those instances is quantify. So if it's under the micro procurement, quantify them, give us the, so if you could just bring back up the template.
Sure. Just bring it up. So here we have the template.
Right. So in the template, you would have the categories, etc. However, when OPR audits your organization, and we will, or if an investigation occurs based on a complaint or some other breach, or there may be some article in the newspaper about some activity that happens, you have to be in a position to justify that it was urgent need and an urgent need from an emergency perspective in order for OPR to not deem it a breach. All right. So I'm cautioning, I know that we still have a way to go in terms of ensuring that everybody within our organizations are on board with what this new Procurement Act requires. However, it is important, critical that whether it's an internal memo or some type of documentation goes out that informs end users, and even probably as far as putting in some repercussions for end users that engage in procurement outside of the procurement department, because it is against what the rules of the Act says. Yeah. So you report it in this portal if you have them. Include them in your micro procurement. Identify if those instances have variations. You will identify your invoice number. And you just go to that variation, Mr. Wax, sorry, the variation in quota share, on the micro procurement side.
Oh, that was
Yeah.
sure.
I just want to highlight something on the micro procurement sheet, for micro procurement variations. In instances here where, and we've had that in the past, where purchase orders have not been issued or contracts have not been issued. In some organizations, what you'll have is invoice orders. Some of you have departmental vouchers. Some of you have petty cash voucher numbers, etc. Whatever reference ties to the actual procurement activity, even though that column B says contract or purchase order reference, because that is what should apply, whatever you would have used. So in this instance, if there's a variation on that activity that happened outside of the procurement process, you still report the variation, you pick up the invoice number or whatever reference you have, include what the original value would have been, and then indicate the value of the variation as well. All right. So we want to really urge you all to inform your internal departments that they should not be engaging in, because it puts not just the procurement department at risk, but your entity as a whole.
Thank you for your response. Regarding the micro procurement category listing, is there flexibility for adding categories that may not be captured in this listing? Or is the expectation that the public body will use other goods, other works, and other services categories provided?
Agreed. So we do have those categories of other works, other goods, other services. We do believe that in most instances, if you all follow the description, that there are categories that will pick up most of your micro procurement. And again, we're stressing on the micro because this is the below 75,000. It should fit into one of the categories. But if it does not, other contracting services, you can look at that category, or other works, other goods, and other services.
Thank you for your response. We have another question. There will not be a confirmation for low value items. I believe this is in response to what we were talking about previously. Is it that the budgetary allocation will work as availability of funds once the public body keeps an account of uncommitted balances and stays within that budgetary allocation?
Yes, we are fine with that, especially for the low value items, because again, the low value items, if we think of them, they are really your operational run of the mill, and payment is normally either due immediately or shortly after you would have committed into that particular transaction. So if we take the buying of water, you need the funds to do it. So you'd have to have the cash on hand. If you're buying stationery, you may have about 30 days to pay, so that that payment should actually happen in the same period that the purchase order would have been issued. All right, remember, we're reporting on a 3-month period. And so we do expect that even if there's no confirmation, these particular micro procurement activities, the award of the activities, the actual value of the activities, and the payments should more or less sync up. It wouldn't be exact. You may have, values that would have been closer to the end of the quarter, but we do expect to see some type of correlation, because again, in many instances, even where you have credit, it does not extend beyond 45 days, which would be within the quarter. All right, so we do expect that there will be, even though there is no formal budgetary confirmation, a letter, you may not have a notice saying, we're spending $200. However, we do expect that you would be able to pay within that time period.
This question also piggybacks on what you would have been mentioning there concerning the confirmation of funds prior to purchase. What does it mean for credit facilities offered by suppliers?
And it's the same thing. So yes, you may have the credit facility of the supplier, but that credit facility is limited. So you have 15 days in some instances, 30 days, 45 days maximum, especially for your low value, low risk items. And so we do expect that even where credit facilities are available, that payment is going to happen in short order.
Definitely. Question maybe for Mr. Bashk. Can a public entity utilize vendors registered on the OPR's repository for micro procurement who are not registered on the entity's internal registry?
Yes, that's correct. But just to confirm, right? So in terms of the maintenance of the registry for micro procurement, the public body will be creating and maintaining their registry. So it's not that the supplier has to come on as they do right now on the procurement repository and register for themselves, but rather the public body is maintaining their own database of suppliers who they will deem as suppliers for micro procurement. So just want to clarify that.
Thank you for your response, Mr. Bashk. So we will just give a moment again. All right, stakeholders. So we'll just give a moment again just to welcome any final questions for our panel here on this topic of contract reporting for Q3. And if not, we will be concluding our session shortly. Thank you very much, stakeholders. So we saw a question in our Q&A section of the portal, and it comes from Mr. Adams. There is a difficulty in locating moderators. Any suggestions? And we're assuming here, Mr. Kent, you're referring to moderators for events. So on that basis, any suggestions?
Well, I'm not sure in terms of if it's he's unable to locate suppliers or moderators. I'm not sure in terms of type of market research that was done to identify what moderators, what the category of moderators would be. So maybe some more information is needed from Mr. Adams.
So maybe he can reach out to the.
He can reach out to
team.
QPR.
Yeah.
And we can advise on that.
All right, no problem. We continue with questions in the chat. In reality, most state entities operate from a point of low funds and credit facility. So therefore, if the funds are not available, how is the entity to operate if the purchases are required?
All right. So the introduction of this act is meant to not only change how we do procurement, but change the whole culture. So it's across whole of government approach, the whole culture of funding, as well as how we do business in Trinidad and Tobago. So while we do appreciate and we understand fully that there are many instances where funding is not provided as needed, we have been stressing to the powers that be and key stakeholders who are responsible for those distribution of funds that exactly what you are alluding to is what will happen in the system. The law is the law, and you are now required to have the funding to be able to do your procurement. And when the funding is unavailable, you can, once you've made all of the necessary communications to try and receive the funding and you have not, you can then say, well, the reason we could not do this activity is because we did not have confirmation of funding, and let the chips fall where they may.
Thank you. Purchases done while staff are out on the field. How does one treat with it? Cash is given to staff due to the nature of the business.
All right, great. So we do have instances and where we have cash advances as well as reimbursement to staff. So they may make purchases out in the field and they come back in and they bring in their bills again. Those would be instances of direct contracting where they may have bought a meal, they may have gotten gas to top up the company vehicle, that type of thing. It's still procurement so that it's recorded in whichever system you utilize to record. What we would stress is that the supplier, so let's say they bought gas, let's say they purchased gas at an NP gas station, then your item would be fuel, not necessarily the person. So all of it is still being tracked. It would be direct contracting in that instance because there was no bidding, there was nothing involved. And again, you can justify why it's direct contracting from a micro procurement standpoint, and you provide us with the value. So it's still going to fill out. So you can have there, it would have been a service or a good, it would have been fuel, and then direct contracting and the value. So it does get captured. Similarly, where you give the cash advances, that cash advance comes more than likely from some type of impress system or petty cash system that you have. And in that instance, you would have recorded in your petty cash system, your monitoring system, what item was purchased, whether it would have been sweets or food for a celebration within the office, a birthday cake, whatever, but it's there. And so you can identify who the supplier is, whether it was a grocery, a bakery, whatever, and the value. So it doesn't take away how the transaction happens. Once it's procurement, you fit it into the necessary categories and you report on it.
So in this instance, where we had just one instance of that, but if it is you did it like 4 times through the month, and that the same process would be 4, then that might be $2,000 worth.
Correct.
Right.
Thank you for your response. Someone is asking, what about doing a purchase order after a good or service has been received? Or maybe not doing the purchase order as soon as to give the ministry time to get their funds together.
All right, so that is against the whole process of what we're doing under this new procurement regime. One, it's not even good best practice to issue a purchase order after the fact. Once you've committed, a purchase order really stands as a contract. And so if you take on a procurement activity without that legal document in hand, you have committed the government or you've committed the country to utilize public funds that may not exist. Because while you are taking a chance and you're saying, well, yes, we will get the money at some junction. What if tomorrow morning Central Bank says Trinidad and Tobago has no money? We're in a position where we cannot pay, but we would have engaged suppliers. In addition to which, there's no true reflection of transactions that we have liabilities for, because there's no PO saying that we've engaged these particular suppliers or contractors who will at the tail end come back and say, well, I did a service or I provided a good, and this particular public body owes me money. So we need to really think about why we do what we do. And I do understand that because of the low funding and because it takes a while, we feel, all right, we will take the chance, or that is the only way. But if you always do that, then you're not actually helping to reform the system. The funding should come to your organization in a timely manner in order to do the activities. So firstly, it's poor procurement practice, poor practice to actually engage in an activity and then issue a PO. That should not be happening at all. And additionally, when we issue that PO, we must have that confidence that we do have the ability to pay in one fashion or the other.
Thank you for your clarification and strong warning, Ms. Ellis. So what if payments made this quarter is for last quarter only? Let's say a transaction made in the last quarter. Is this recorded in both fulfilled and unfulfilled spreadsheets?
All right, so this is dealing with the we should talk about fulfilled and unfulfilled. This is dealing with the standard template, which would cover all of the values over $75,000. Payment progress for the quarter reflects exactly what it says. Payment made, it does not matter when the activity occurred. Once you made that payment in the period, it could be in relation to a purchase order or contract that would have started in 2022. Once payment is made on any procurement activity, then it is recorded in the payment progress sheet for the quarter, right? That information gets filled out and you complete all of the necessary. So in the instance where, let's say, for example, you're now paying on an activity that happened last month, or at the end of the last quarter, the value of work completed in the quarter in column H may be 0 because the work may have already been done. The payment is now going to be made in this quarter. So where we have the value of work paid, which should be lower down in column K, right? In column K, that is where you would record the actual value of the payment. So from a payment in progress perspective, it is all payment. So once you made a payment in the quarter on a procurement activity, it gets reported in this sheet. I want to speak to unfulfilled because the participant would have used unfulfilled in making the correlation between payments and whether or not it was unfulfilled. Unfulfilled has a definition and it speaks to incomplete, delayed, and terminated. All right, and it's in the definitions table that we provided. A contract that is incomplete, and I'm going to stress on the incomplete because we've seen that there have been misinterpretations of what this term means. Everybody understands terminated and most people get delayed. The incomplete is where we've seen over the last 2 quarters, persons are still having a challenge to wrap their mind around the concept. Incomplete speaks to where a contract in itself, the timeline, so whether it's a PO or a contract, the actual expiration of both things, it has lapsed. So we've passed the contract end date, the PO delivery date is gone, but the actual performance of the contract has not been completed. So there's still work that needs to be done. There's still goods that need to be delivered after those end dates. That's when we speak to incomplete. Incomplete does not relate to I have not yet paid the contractor, but the work is done. If the work is done, the contract itself is fulfilled. What is outstanding is the payment. So we're urging you all not to mix up what that term is with payment. So if I have outstanding payment or if work is still going on in relation to procurement activity and the end dates have not yet lapsed, it is not incomplete, it's ongoing. Once those end dates have lapsed and there's still outstanding activities to be performed by the supplier, then it is deemed incomplete.
Thanks for that, Miss Ellis. We actually had a slight follow-up question from Sherry, who was asking, unfulfilled is essentially open purchase orders or cancelled purchase orders?
So it's neither. A cancelled purchase order, sorry, let me take that back. A cancelled purchase order would be considered terminated, right? So while we have it as unfulfilled contract terminated, when we speak to contracts, we're speaking to both an actual contract or a PO that could be used as a contract, a standalone PO. If the PO is the purchase order is cancelled, it is treated as a terminated purchase order. So we would have said to the supplier or contractor, we actually no longer want your service. We are terminating this arrangement that we have with you. So it's cancelled. We're no longer going to engage in this activity with your organization. So it would be classified as terminated. But if it's ongoing, then your contract is in force. If the delivery date has not yet expired, your contract is your purchase order is still in force. It's not incomplete. It only becomes incomplete once those timelines in terms of the end dates, your delivery date has passed, and you've not gotten what you were supposed to, your contract expiration date has lapsed, and there's still outstanding activities to be performed.
And
That's where it is.
where do they capture this information?
It's captured in the unfulfilled in the quota sheet.
Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah.
We have another question. If there are no micro procurement variations to report, does this still need to be filled but with variation value of $0?
All right. So the answer to that is no. In the checklist, in the micro procurement checklist, you would see that in the general section of that checklist, I believe, there's a note there that says that if you have no micro procurements for the period, then you're going to inform OPR that you don't have. So you see, the first thing on the checklist says where your public body has nothing to report for the quarter, a letter was submitted to the OPR within the time period stating no micro procurement activities occurred within the period. So you will just inform us via a letter to the OPR to the same contract reporting, contract report at opr.org.tt that you actually had no activities for the quarter. You don't need to actually complete the template. And that applies as well for the standard template for everything over 75,000, you do the same thing.
Thank you for your clarification. Someone has another question. If the same supplier is used multiple times under 75,000, but the total is above 75,000 within the quarter for a particular category, how is that recorded? As a micro procurement or not?
All right. So again, it begs the question of the procurement process that would have been engaged. So I'm going to use an example. Let's take I want a category.
Let's pull it up.
Yeah. It's under goods, services, and services.
Category.
Yeah. All right. So let's take furniture and furnishings. So we're using that as a category. And within the time period over the year, so we're going back to that section 6 and estimating, right? And how we plan what we're going to do. If as a public body, I know that I need to get 15 chairs, right? So I'm purchasing 15 chairs for the year. That's part of our plan to do 15 chairs. And while, yes, the money may not come as we would like it, and it may be coming in batches, if I'm going to purchase 15 chairs for the year, and I know that I'm probably going to use direct contracting or single source or sole source, right? So I'm using the obvious one. So the single, the sole, and the direct contracting. And we go directly to, we know we're going to this one supplier, and we're going to be buying the 15 chairs. But I'm buying 3 in quarter 1, I'm buying 5 in quarter 2, I'm buying another 3 again in quarter 3, and I'm buying the remaining in quarter 4. Then what you've done, in essence, is split your procurement, which is not allowed. because you know upfront you are actually going to purchase 15 shares using one of those methods. However, if you've used a different method, let's say selective to some degree or open bidding, and there is no guarantee of who will be the provider of this particular good or service. So you're not going to one contractor, you put it out for open tender. And so I could have 5 chairs, which is not the example that you're giving me, but I'm using it so that we can all learn. I have 5 chairs in Q1. I buy 5 chairs because that's what my funding allowed. And when I go out to the market, contractor A or supplier A would have won the tender. And then when I go back out for the 3 chairs in Q2, contractor B won 3 chairs. Then each one of them stands on their own individually. But the minute you go to selective to some degree and anything that is non-competitive, it may indicate or it may there may be the concern of splitting of the procurement activity. So you need to be wary where you have multiple services going to one contractor, especially if it's not via competitive process. If it happened that way, that you did a competitive process and every single time this one person won, then fine. But if you would have gone through the activity and you're using single source or sole source or direct contracting, and you know you're going to be going to this one person, estimating would say that I'm already going to go over. I know within the 12-month period, I'm going to be over that 75,000. It should not be classed as micro procurement.
Thank you for that clarification. And just to point, Ms. Alexander, we saw your question very similar in the response that Ms. Ellis just gave. So we hope that answers it. If the UNSPSC list provided in the report does not have all items, could the list given online be used?
Well, in this case, this is the UNSPC. You're reporting what would have, I'm assuming this is question is relating to the contract template, right?
Mhm.
So the list, you'll be reporting what you would have actually procured already. So then you would have had to have used a code that's on the system existing then. So you really shouldn't have any need when you're reporting now that there is a new code, because what we would have done, we extract the UNSPC list that's on the depository and we have here. So if it is that you do need to add a code in the future, again, you can reach out to us and we add it to the code and then we update the codes on the sheet going forward.
Just a comment from one of our stakeholders. It seems as though the act can cause the closure of state entities based on the lack of funds for purchasing of items that are critical to the life of the organization.
And we do appreciate that. And that is a statement of fact. It can, which is why it's a change of culture, not just for the procuring entities, but also those that fund the procuring entities. They have to come up to scratch as well to ensure that the funding is there, because the actual provision of the public service to the public is dependent on the public bodies having what they need to function.
But a reverse to that, if you consider it, is that this also prevents certain suppliers from going out of business, because
Correct.
there are many public bodies who will engage with suppliers and
Correct.
unable to pay them,
Correct.
and they go out of business.
Yeah.
Most definitely. Is market research to be done for micro procurement? Also, is micro procurement to be part of the APP?
All right, so we're speaking to market research. Market research should be done for all your procurement. There are some, again, direct contracting does not require the market research. It assumes that it's low risk, low value. It is something that everybody knows the prices are the same everywhere you go. So when you look at what direct contracting involves, it really doesn't necessarily need market research. But all of your other procurement, you should be looking at your market and understanding what the market has to offer what values are there, quality, what probably even discounts may be available to your organization. You should be engaging in that actively all of the time. So yes, market research should be done. In terms of the APP, the annual plan procurement schedule that is provided and your annual plan.
So, micro procurement is not required to be included in your annual schedule of planned procurement activities, which is normally published on your website. However, your small scale procurements are required to be included in your annual schedule of planned procurement activities.
Right. So it's in the schedule.
So it's in the schedule.
In the schedule for small, not in the schedule for micro, but everything is in your APP.
In your plan. Yes.
Everything is in
Micro and small will be included in your annual procurement plan, but micro will not be included in your schedule. Small and above will be included in your schedule.
Thank you very much, Ms. Singh, for clarifying. So just as we wrap up this morning session, stakeholders, may I just remind you that we are recording this session. And for those who have shared that they're having audio issues, we will share a recording of this link to you via email, as well as a copy of the template, a copy of the sample, as well as the checklists that you can use in assisting you to complete your reports in a timely fashion. So since there are no questions, we thank you again on behalf of the OPR team for your time in attending this morning's session. And as a reminder, you are submitting your reports to contract reporting at opr.org.tt no later than 4:30 p.m. on July 22nd of this year. And this is for Q3. Thank you very much again, stakeholders, and have a wonderful day.